Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Global CCS Institute's webinar on CCS and international and national policy. Today, we will be discussing CCS as it relates to the G20 Presidency and COP28. My name is Ruth Gebrahimedhin, and I'm the EMEA Advocacy and Communications Manager with the Institute, and I will be moderating today's discussions. Next slide. For those who might not be familiar with us, the Global CCS Institute is an international think tank whose mission is to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture and storage, a vital technology needed to tackle the climate challenge and deliver climate neutrality. Next slide. Today's session will include a presentation from each of our invited speakers, which will be followed by a brief Q&A at the end. You can submit your questions using the Q&A function on the Zoom control panel that you see at the bottom of your screen there. And in the coming days, a recording of this webinar will be made available on our website. Next slide. So just a brief scene setting before we delve into today's topic. Over the last year, we saw carbon capture and storage steadily make its way into national and international climate policy discussions and initiatives. And this was illustrated through a number of efforts, including the ongoing Carbon Management Challenge, which was launched by the United States, which has since been taken on by a number of countries, along with activities led by the G7 and the G20, which acknowledged CCUS as an industrial decarbonization tool. And as the Bonn Climate Conference got underway this June, a precursor to November's COP28 that will be held in Dubai, CCS was again subject to multilateral attention. The technology was mentioned through several channels and formal negotiations, including during discussions tied to the Global Stocktake and the Mitigation Work Programme, and we'll dive into that a bit more later. Concurrently, with India holding the G20 presidency this year, the country was in the spotlight as conversations around sustainable development and tackling the climate challenge got underway. India itself has taken strides to heighten climate ambitions, including through the approval of a domestic carbon credit trading scheme, and has also announced its intentions to shore up opportunities related to CCUS research, development, and collaboration. Next slide. So to speak with us about that and more are three experts on the topic, including Noura Al-Amir, who's the Institute's Senior International Climate Change Policy Advisor, who's also supporting the COP Presidency's Energy Transition Team as a senior specialist. We also have Errol Pinto, Senior Consultant of Policy and Commercial with the Global CCS Institute, and Dr. Vikram Vishal, an Associate Professor at the Department of Earth Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, and Visiting Professor at MIT. We'll first begin with Noura, who recently authored the Institute's latest report titled CCS Milestones on the Road to COP28. Noura, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and I'll be presenting some snippets from my latest report, which was sort of the CCS milestones on the road to COP28. So next slide, please. So one of the main developments this year was the culmination of the IPCC reporting cycle, the 6th reporting cycle, and that was with the Summary for Policymakers report that came out in March. And that kind of gave us an overview and is really critical this year because it will inform the next Global Stocktake. Next slide, please. So here are some of the main outcomes of the Summary for Policymakers report that relate to CCS. So we have net zero CO2 energy systems entail a substantial reduction in overall fossil fuel use, minimal use of unabated fossil fuels, and use of CCS in the remaining fossil fuel systems. Global rates of CCS deployment are far below those in modeled pathways, limiting global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees, and that hard to abate is counterbalanced by the deployment of CDR. So hard to abate emissions, that is. So next slide, please. So further to these developments, we had a lot of things that happened in the springtime. So in April, we had the Biden administration's launch of the Carbon Management Challenge at the Major Economies Forum. This was joined by a number of countries. We also had in tandem with this the IEA Credible Pathways report of 1.5. And here on the fourth pillar, carbon management was mentioned, including the 1.2 gigaton target by 2030 of carbon dioxide stored. And then moving on to May, we had the G7 Hiroshima Leaders Communique, where CCS was mentioned in the context of acknowledgement and that recycling technologies can be part of a broad portfolio of decarbonization solutions. So next slide, please. More recently, we had talking about the G20 in this discussion. We had the Goa Energy Transition Ministerial Meeting outcome document, and that happened in July. And one of the main outcomes here is that CCS is mentioned as a mature clean energy technology, and then we also have the inclusion of carbon removal, so both direct air capture and bioenergy carbon capture and storage. And critical to this is, accelerating that these technologies will accelerate the energy transition as per national priorities and circumstances. Next slide, please. Looking to Bonn in June. So, we had the Mitigation Work Programme, which was newly launched after COP27. And our CEO of the Institute, Jared Daniels, was part of the technical experts for the Mitigation Work Programme, and he was joined by Tim Dixon as well from the IEA GHG. And there we really heard, we had a full day of parties speaking about CCS and telling us, whether they are, developments in CCS or curiosities and concerns. And I think critical to this was in at Bonn, there was no actual agenda item that was adopted for the Mitigation Work Programme. So the discussions from the Work Programme will be captured in the chair's summary, and we will see how this develops as we go towards COP28. Looking at the global stocktake. So the global stocktake is a critical moment because it's going to take stock basically of all the development that's happened towards achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. So we've concluded the technical dialogues with the third technical dialogue in Bonn. And we've been part of those part of the different rounds, and we had roundtables, and we had a World Cafe. There was various submissions, poster sessions, video submissions, and we did see from the floor various interventions on CCS from various parties. And coming up next, and actually today, was the UNFCCC published its report from the first global stocktake, and that was just an hour ago. And I had a quick skim, and I did see instances where CCS is indeed mentioned, particularly when you're looking at financing CCS. So, going towards COP28, we will have an in-person workshop in October, another submission round in September, and then high-level committee events at COP28, and then hopefully we will see the outcomes of the global stocktake at COP this year. Next slide, please. Article 6. So Article 6 is the carbon markets, and it is still ongoing. And in the context of CCS, we haven't reached the stage of talking about, CCS, point source CCS. However, we are talking about carbon dioxide removals, and in that context, we do see, the future of CCS in carbon markets in that space. So, when you look at Article 6.2, which is the bilateral side of the carbon markets, there really is still, rapid capacity building needed and a manual to be developed, as well as issues and clarification on, various aspects of the registry where there is an initial registry that has been published, but we still have to kind of go through the details in that. Looking to Article 6.4, which is the mechanism, there is still clarity needed on transferring CDM methodologies. CCS already has a methodology that has been worked on over the years that could be applied to this going forward. We also have ongoing topics with interlinkages with Article 6.2. We still have issues on emissions avoidance. And then when it comes to carbon dioxide removals, there were a number of submissions and structured public consultations that happened this year. And hopefully this will put us in a good place by COP28 to come up with guidance on removals that will inform technological removals, but also eventually will affect carbon capture and storage in the carbon market. I think also critical to Article 6 this year is there were a number of announcements on new communication channels, LinkedIn pages. So, we're looking at more stakeholder engagement as we go forward in this process. Next slide, please. And just briefly to talk about response measures, this is kind of getting more into the granular details, but response measures is essentially looking at any socioeconomic impacts of mitigation measures. And just to mention that CCS is part of Activity 5 of the work plan. And so, there's a report that has been published, and just to show that there is more kind of ongoing work on CCS. In terms of transition, the just energy transition and economic diversification. Next slide, please. Just a few pictures of our participation in Bonn. So just to kind of, give a visual. So we have the Mitigation Work Programme on the top left, where Jared was addressing the different parties and answering any questions that came up that day. You can see the poster session and how it was, the World Cafe, and the sort of informal way for parties to discuss with each other, as well as the observer organizations on different aspects of mitigation. And then, an Article 6 negotiating room, which is always very, very popular. Next slide, please. I think just to mention to the audience, those of you who are from the private sector, the Race to Zero initiative is led by the high-level champions and is to rally non-state actors, so this includes the private sector, to take rigorous and immediate action to have global emissions by 2030. And this happens through meeting a minimum participation criteria and is the largest initiative of this kind. And we have accelerators there as part of Net Zero, including from the Global Cement and Concrete Association. And also something that has been overlooked is there's also support welcomed for the climate champion breakthroughs that happened in Glasgow, which includes a 2030 target for 50 new CCS networks reaching FID by 2026. So, other ways for participation and collaboration through Race to Zero, and this is a direct link to the UNFCCC as well. Next slide, please. And then just with my COP28 hat on, just to show an overview of what the presidency events thematic days look like. So December 5th is energy and industry, just energy. And recently we've added Indigenous Peoples Day, so that will be on December the 5th. So looking forward to the events there, and we will hopefully also be including CCS on that day. So thank you. That concludes my presentation for today.
Great, thanks, Nora. Yeah, promising movements forward, it seems. So COP28 will be an exciting challenge. And as we mentioned earlier, the G20 presidency was hosted in India this year, and the country itself has been moving forward with climate efforts to help drive carbon capture and storage. The Institute's Errol Pinto, who's a senior policy and commercial consultant with the Institute, has authored a report on the topic. So Errol, I'll hand it over to you to speak more on that.
Thank you, Ruth, and good morning to everyone attending. So I'll be speaking about India's recent movements as it relates to CCS and with some brief interludes to carbon markets as well. So to start, I'll be speaking about the Energy Conservation Bill. India's central government passed an amendment to the Energy Conservation Bill last year. This was after COP27, towards the end of November, early December. The bill, or the amendment rather, sets up a domestic carbon credits trading scheme within the country, and it's administered or will be administered centrally. Some background to this: India's lower house passed the amendment in August of last year. So it's been about a year since the lower house passed this bill. And then the upper house passed it very quickly towards the end of the year. So it's now law. Entities within India will be allotted credits and can trade them domestically whenever the carbon credits trading scheme gets set up nationally. Next slide. Additionally, towards the end of the year, India's central government also published a CCUS report. India has a central governmental think tank called Niti Aayog, and they commissioned and released a policy framework paper on CCUS. It's a very broad, comprehensive paper which provides a lay of the land as it relates to CCS, both within the country and outside the country. It is essentially a recommendation to the government, and it has several authors, many contributors who bring significant CCS experience and expertise, both within the country and abroad. It's a wide-ranging report, as I mentioned, and it acknowledges the crucial importance of CCS to decarbonization and to the energy transition. The report also discusses carbon credits as a recommended policy mechanism, and there's a further recommendation on carbon taxes as well. So broadly, the report covers costs in various sectors, especially heavy industry, an overview of international pricing and financing mechanisms. For example, there's a discussion on 45Q and the associated tax credits that come with that from the United States. There's also a recommendation for India to set up a public sector corporation to help promote and finance CCS projects within the country. Next slide. So these two developments speak to very efficient timing and coordination from India's central government. India also updated its NDCs at COP27 last November. And both the amendment to the Energy Conservation Bill and the CCUS report came immediately after COP27, towards the end of the year. These developments and the timing of these developments further reiterate the role that the central government in India plays, and it's a key role. They provide indications that India will have a supportive policy framework supported by the central government that will help meet India's climate commitments. And there are indications that the right incentives and the right financing mechanisms are certainly being looked at and could be of use to India further down the line. It's also worth noting that the central governmental think tank that commissioned this report, Niti Aayog, is chaired by India's Prime Minister. So there's coordination, again, at the central and highest levels of government. Next slide. So broadly, what is the status of CCS in India? CCS is currently not included in the carbon credits trading scheme that I mentioned earlier. The Power Ministry, though, has begun a consultation process with various stakeholders as the regulatory framework and process gets shaped out within the country. The CCUS report recommends an incentive-based approach and mentions carbon credits as a key mechanism. These two developments together indicate flexibility for CCUS to be included in the future as the regulations for the trading scheme are firmed up and are drafted currently. And this is not without international precedent. In fact, several jurisdictions have broadened their policy frameworks to include CCS in the future. So India is not unique in this respect. An Indian ministry has listed CCS as a removal activity under Article 6.2, under the Article 6.2 mechanism of the Paris Agreement. And India has also announced the establishment of 2 national centers of excellence in carbon capture and utilization in 2022. These are 2 centers in 2 different parts of the country. And lastly, but not least, India's Ministry of Science and Technology has been evaluating and is evaluating CCS technologies. So that's a broad overview of what of the status of CCS in India at this current time. Next slide. We spoke briefly about, or Noora spoke briefly about India's G20 presidency earlier, but India currently holds the G20 presidency. And like I mentioned, they've updated their NDCs as of last year. India took over the G20 presidency on the 1st of December and will hold it through to the day that COP28 begins later this year. Climate finance will be key for India to achieve its climate goals. And the central government has indicated that this is a high priority, both through the energy transition and also through other means that the central government has. They've also indicated that it's a priority area for the energy transition. In a primer document that was prepared for the G20 presidency, India has made several references to reducing carbon emissions and carbon intensity as they pursue decarbonization across the various sectors. And this primer document has also mentioned the role CCS can play in meeting these goals. And in February of this year, the central government, through the G20 Secretariat, has made several references to low carbon development pathways and deploying these associated technologies within India. So there's coordination and there's aligned messaging, both from the central government and the G20 Secretariat that India currently chairs. Next slide, please. So in summary, where do we go from here? There's still a need to formalize a national framework for CCS within India, but these outlines are beginning to take shape, as we've indicated and as we've seen in the preceding slides. The significance of the timing of both the CCUS report with the overlap of the G20 presidency is actually quite important. And in the last 8 months or so since the passing of the amendment to the Energy Conservation Bill, India has begun the work to set up the domestic carbon credits trading scheme. This is a broad scheme, so there's a fair amount of regulatory work that would need to get done, and the consultation process has begun. And this indicates that at the national level, the central government does see the reduction of carbon emissions as significantly important. And with that, I conclude my portion of this talk. Thank you, Ruth.
Great. Thanks, Errol. That was a great overview. And our next speaker will elaborate a bit further on CCS progress in India. Dr. Vikram Vishal is an associate professor at the Department of Earth Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. And Dr. Vishal has been supporting CCS developments in India and is also one of the authors of the NITI Aayog report on CCS, which Errol briefly touched on. Dr. Vikram Vishal, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for giving me the opportunity by GCCSI. So I represent the National Center of Excellence in Carbon Capture and Utilization set up by the Ministry of Science and Technology, the Department of Science and Technology of the Government of India. And I also represent my institute, the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay in Mumbai. And I'm also representing my organization company called Ujanovec Private Limited as I talk about these aspects of CCS in India. So India is one of the leading emitters of carbon dioxide, as we are aware of. It's one of the top leading countries, the number three, emitting somewhere around 2.6 gigatons of carbon dioxide annually. And therefore, a lot of impetus has been pushed on cleaning up our energy sector. And in that light, at COP26 in Glasgow, the Honorable Prime Minister of India did announce the Panchamrit, which are the 5-point commitments by the Government of India and the country as a whole. So one of the important aspects is for India to achieve net zero by 2070. Other key relevant point includes that India will achieve the reduction of 1 billion ton of CO2 emissions by 2030, and also that the country will reduce its emission intensity of the economy by 45% by 2030. In this regard, different commitments are coming up, different organizations, different industries, companies, they are also declaring their net zero goals. And it is clear that the mandates that have come from the Government of India is becoming more and more binding for different sectors, largely the hard-to-abate sectors. And in that regard, we understand that CCUS will be a key pathway for India to achieve net zero and by 2017 and also meet the climate goals by the country. There are several CCUS projects that are ongoing at a very small scale in India, but there is confidence in doing capture of carbon dioxide and conversion to various chemicals. For instance, a 200 ton per day CO2 capture plant in Tuticorin for soda ash production. The other one is a small scale 5 ton per day CO2 capture plant from a blast furnace of Tata Steel for their internal use, and then a small unit by NTPC where they capture carbon dioxide and convert it convert it to methanol. And while we are looking at different pathways, the Department of Science and Technology and the CSIR are promoting a lot of research initiatives to accelerate the R&D in this sector. So one of the important aspects, as you mentioned, that India is hosting the G20 Presidency, but India is also hosted this year, last month, the Mission Innovation and the Clean Energy Ministerial. And within the mission innovation vertical, India has supported several projects for R&D, for deployment of, basically evaluation of different techniques and development of indigenous technologies. Then the DST has also promoted under accelerating CCS technologies with global partnerships for various aspects of carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Further, India has also entered into the new Clean Energy Technology Partnership, where we will be partnering with different countries. As also mentioned by a previous speaker, that India has established 2 national centers of excellence in CCUS. One happens to be in Bengaluru, which is the Jawaharlal Nehru Center for Advanced Scientific Research, while the other one is hosted by the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. Further, the group of students are fairly active in this domain now, and they are pursuing their research, and also startups are coming up in CCUS in India. And one of the important highlights could be the X Prize won by one of the teams in India that will support capture of carbon dioxide and conversion to useful chemicals. However, we do understand with the kind of emissions that we talk in India, are we really going to meet the goals by doing CO2 utilization? And it's getting more and more evident with time that India needs to address COC's carbon dioxide capture by storing the captured carbon dioxide. So while we have worked on the potential for CO2 storage in India, we look at different pathways. So what you're seeing here are the green bubbles, which talk about the CO2 storage in coal formations, the orange bubbles that talk about the CO2 storage in the enhanced oil recovery component, and then the blue bubbles which are talking about storage in the saline aquifers. And then there are red boxes which talk about CO2 storage in basalt formation. So India is geologically very diverse, and if you look at different pathways for storage of carbon dioxide, clearly India's theoretical CO2 storage potential stands at 395 to 614 gigatons. So looking at India's emissions at the moment, and then while we are peaking our emissions in, let's say, next decade or so, in the transition that we're talking about, a good amount of it can be abated by doing CCS. Further, like the concept of hub and cluster is developing around the world, we try to also map that where are these point sources of emissions, particularly the LPSs, which are the large point sources of emissions, located with respect to the CO2 storage hubs. So when we talk about these different saline aquifers or depleting oil and gas fields, which are largely located in the onshore as well as offshore in the peninsular India, we look into these clusters and we have tried to map that almost a good percentage of these large point sources do exist in the vicinity, that they can be linked and CO2 can be transported from different sources towards the hub, which will be able to store carbon dioxide. And this, on the right hand side, the map of India shows 13 such clusters which were formulated based on CO2 emissions from different hard to abate sectors like steel, refinery, fertilizer, gas-fired, cement, and coal-fired plants. So the idea is that these CO2 sources can be linked, and the injection of CO2 can happen in some of the hubs that India potentially has. But these are all theoretical estimates. Actual work is not really, actual implementation is still a little distant from where we stand at this point in time. So did talk about some of the aspects of initiatives by the government of India. So one of the major developments have been around the policy framework and CCUS deployment mechanism in India, developed by the Niti Aayog, and that talks about different pathways that India can achieve its emission goals, and rather the climate goals, by cutting down the emissions as well as the capturing the CO2 and storing in different reservoirs. Secondly, the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas developed a roadmap which presents different short-term, medium-term, and long-term actionable directions, particularly for the oil and gas sectors. Now, the oil and gas sectors are both the refineries, which can supply CO2, at the same time the depleting oil and gas fields, which can store carbon dioxide, and as well as the saline aquifers, which are in some of the vicinities of these, category 1, as we call them, the oil fields that are producing CO2, and some of the fields that are producing coal-bed methane. So in this regard, this roadmap also is from the government of India, and it does talk about some of the incentives, financial incentives, the viability gap funding, and the support that is needed, accelerating R&D, and so on in these sectors for meeting the goals of CCS. Further, as India is hosting the G20 presidency in this year, there were two reports that were released. One was the technical report, another was the financial report. And both the reports highlight different G20 level assessments for different countries, including India. And it highlights that the storage assessments have to be done, acceptance in global carbon markets have to be brought in, as well as the G20 level supportive policies would be helpful in encouraging investments of CCUS in India. Further, the Ministry of Power and Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change have been developing the carbon credit trading scheme for decarbonization. We do understand that, the kind of global development of this carbon trading scheme, India does not want to lag, and rather, is developing a very proactive scheme for a implementable scheme for India. It is clear that a lot of startups have also started to come up, and therefore this technology research brief by the Climate Tech and Climate Collective was also released this year, and it highlights some of the initiatives in India around CCUS, and possibly with some sort of supports and different mechanisms will be able to accelerate CCUS at scale as desired and as required. Research efforts have to be diversified. As mentioned earlier, the Ministry of Science and Technology, both through CSIR and DST, have been doing quite a bit in supporting, a huge number of projects that are at different TRLs. So in India, the technology readiness levels are largely in the R&D stage, so TRL 3 and 4. but through different support and partnership by the mission innovation countries and the industries, both in India and abroad. A lot of activities have initiated, and these will pave the pathways, but a clear direction from the government and then supports and incentives will be important for accelerating the development of CCUS in the country. In summary, that India's CO2 emissions is high, and we have not peaked our emissions, so we'll continue to emit carbon dioxide. Therefore, tremendous efforts are required for reduction of carbon dioxide emissions for the country. The map on the image on the right hand side shows a generalized world scenario for net zero by 2070, which is also the year for India to achieve net zero. We could look at different pathways that are significant in achieving the net zero goals. But in that, if you look at the CCUS, it accounts for nearly 14 to 32% of all the efforts, in maintaining net zero or achieving net zero by 2070. IEA estimate says that India will account for nearly 20% of the global industrial CCS by 2060. And with CCUS, we can continue to use fossil fuel up to as much as 95%, 95 to 30%, of which coal can account for up to 5%. What is needed? We need to accelerate the R&D. We need to advance the TRLs at different levels, from proof of concept to the pilots, demonstration, and the commercial levels. We need collaborations both within the country and outside with the knowledge that has been gained. Industrial engagements are required, and capacity building are required, which have all been initiated. A summary from the G20 reports highlights, as well as the NITI Aayog report highlights, that the dedicated or authority is required in the country. Favorable policies have to be provided. We will need funding support for accelerating CCUS. A good framework for monitoring, measurement, reporting, and verification is required. There need to be incentives, and there could be mandates as well. These aspects will, when put together in a very systematic way, could accelerate CCS in India. For India, it is important to highlight that the CCS has to be linked with just transition. We understand that we have a good amount of social responsibility, a country where coal is still providing a majority of energy, and therefore, to provide increased social license and regional equity, CCS must be linked with just transition. As mentioned, India hosted the G20 CCUS seminar, and at the same time released those two reports. So the National Center of Excellence was the knowledge partner and advisor to the whole CCUS at G20, and we have come up with documents which are freely available on the internet for everyone to read. And all of them highlight that India's commitments towards CCS is growing, and as a responsible global citizen, we are committed to cut down the emissions in over a period of time, and definitely gain from the knowledge that has been developed or acknowledged, acquired over a period of time around the world, that should come and accelerate the CCUS deployment in India over a period of time. So I want to thank you for the opportunity. I want to thank the entire group of students and fellows at the National Center who have helped me in this study. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vikram, and all of our speakers. I think we have a few more minutes now. I think for the next 10 or 15 minutes, I'll just ask everyone to turn on their cameras. We'll have a quick Q&A just to kind of unpack a bit further what we just discussed. But maybe I'll stick with Vikram for now before we get into the carbon credit scheme and back to COP discussions. Vikram, you mentioned the National Center of Excellence being developed, which is a huge accomplishment. Is that an indication that CCU or CCS dialogue is being supported by both industry and policymakers, or are we building those bridges now? What's the overall reception?
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. So essentially, the National Centers of Excellence have been developed interim to what was already happening in India, clearly through the Mission Innovation Scheme 1, where the DST partnered with several countries in the Mission Innovation Initiative. And the need was realized that we need to have a body which not only participates in different R&D activities, but also links those with the industry and kind of develops a network of stakeholders in the country, and also provides the right set of knowledge and policy advocacy to the government of India. In that respect, a center of excellence functions just like any other CCS center of excellence around the world, by bringing together the all the key players in this whole thing, and also learn from what is happening in the international scenario and bring them forward, for as I mentioned, to fast track CCUS in India. And clearly that has been happening since the announcement and establishments of the two centers of excellence in the country. I must also mention possibly a third one is also underway, and sometime in this year we'll be hearing about it from the ministry.
And you also mentioned that the G20 was, of course, hosted in Goa, India. Do you think that also helped move the needle forward when it came to discussions around CCS domestically?
Yeah, rightly so, Arut. So the participation of different countries and bringing together the expertise and the knowledge that has been gained from around the world, when we look at what has been happening in this space, and when we talk more freely about it, share the information, share the knowledge. India hosting G20, India hosting Clean Energy Ministerial and the Mission Innovation Ministerial all together at one time in this year, 2023, is definitely special for CCUS. And I see this momentum gathering acceleration with all the international players visiting India and looking to opportunities for collaboration and supporting the development of CCUS in India.
Yeah, and related to the carbon credit scheme, I know it's still early days, and I see there's questions in the chat about this as well. Maybe Errol, you can unpack a little bit what sectors you think can benefit from the carbon credit schemes, and whether or not CCS is even directly noted when it's discussed at present.
Yeah, so CCS currently isn't included. As I mentioned when I was speaking, the stakeholder consultations are ongoing at this time to set up the regulatory framework for the scheme. But when it comes to which industries can benefit, I think certainly, so firstly, it's open at this point only to entities that are based in India. So it's a domestic scheme. But entities across heavy industry and other sectors could certainly benefit from the participation in the scheme. And the signs currently do indicate that the government is taking a lot of this into consideration, because there's been a careful consideration of how CCS can assist as a decarbonization pathway. So with all the signs that Vikram just mentioned that India has been giving over the course of 2023, it looks like the government is well informed when it comes to the benefits of CCS. So it'll be interesting to see how they both integrate the findings of studies that they have commissioned themselves into the scheme when it does get set up, especially as it applies to heavy industry.
Yeah. And we know that there are amendments. Do we have an idea of when it will be operational?
Not at this time. The stakeholder consultations have begun over the course of the last 8 months. The law only got passed in December of 2022. So it's fairly early days. And for a scheme of this size, for a country of this size, with the number of domestic entities within India, it's quite a large task. And India's government has always been careful when it comes to implementing national mechanisms, national schemes, and rightfully so, because the country is quite large, and I think the government will take a similar kind of reasoned, steady approach when it comes to setting it up. And stakeholder consultations, I think, will be key.
Yeah. And Vikram, you mentioned that we need to advance R&D when it comes to CCS in India. What are the opportunities that you're seeing when it comes to that?
Yes, Ruth. So all three verticals of science and technology are important. So whether it's capture, so developing low cost capture solution is important across different kind of streams that are coming from different industries. At the same time, when we look at the utilization pathways, which utilization pathways can actually produce commercially scalable products that can be taken up by the market when the prices of the product go high when we are capturing carbon dioxide and converting them. So kind of that is also an important aspect. But at the same time, different industries which are facing the challenge of cutting down their emissions in terms of their own net zero goals. So what are the pathways that they can take up when they talk about, let's say for the steel sector, India is currently producing around 140 million metric ton of steel, but in next decade or so, we have a goal of 300 million metric steel per annum production. So if we are not like capturing CO2 from the existing and also not planning for CCUS in the upcoming plants, it may be too late. So therefore, these initiatives by different ministries and the industries are going to favor CCUS at in the larger picture. At the same time, we do understand that CCUS is happening around the world at various stages of development. We have over 500 projects now, and it has just been rapidly developing space around the world. So India is acknowledging that, and different different R&D institutions, industries, and their R&D wings are working toward them. In terms of storage, yeah, the pore space mapping is very, very crucial. So once these, let's say, few of these pilot projects are identified based on the umbrella assessment, a very detailed layer by layer assessment have to be done. And that's only from the science and technology part. But when you look at the operations, management, and then the social aspects, the funding aspect, the legal and regulatory aspects. So all of them, if you look at it holistically, there are different verticals, and all of them have to be assessed and done in parallel when we want to deploy CCUS in India.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, I mean, CCS is happening around the world at different stages. And Noura, you kind of have the luxury of seeing, having a bit of a bird's eye view, particularly when you went to Bonn, and you kind of saw those conversations happening on the ground. How would you assess the current policy cooperations around CCS? Is there greater alignment this year as we head into COP28?
Thank you, Ruth, for the question, and thank you to both the speakers for the very informative conversation today. So I would say, yes, there does appear to be strong policy signals happening and some momentum for CCS from governments worldwide. I think when we look at the Mitigation Work Programme, what was clear from the room is that there really is a willingness to cooperate with each other, and that would include not just North-South cooperation, but also South-South cooperation. And interestingly, just talking about the National Center of Excellence in India, that could be it's the establishment of such CCS centers of excellence can help with the knowledge sharing on policy regulation, assessment for storage, accounting, monitoring, storage, permitting. There's a list of requirements that are needed to really implement CCS within a nation. So that would also be an important part of that mix. Looking kind of further, there is still a level of coherence that's needed when it comes to CCS. So alignment on methodologies and data, harmonizing, national and international rules on carbon dioxide removals, the coordination on cross-border transfer of CO2 for storage. So there are still a number of kind of components that need to be, further discussed together in the international community. So that's sort of, that's kind of a takeaway.
And you also mentioned earlier during your presentation, new communications channels tied to making sure that some of these items are actioned. Where did that stem from? Where did that, what really encouraged that?
So the communication channels for carbon management. So that through the carbon. So yeah, I mean, there are various different channels to action. So one of the ones I did mention was the race to zero. And I noticed a question in the Q&A on just an expansion on the non-state actors. And, that is just to kind of break that down even further. It is, what the Race to Zero campaign is a commitment from these non-state actors to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050 at the latest. And there are certain applications and a follow-up process to that. And to break it down further, it includes things like 8,000 companies, more than 8,000 companies, more than almost 600 financial institutions, over 1,000 cities, over 50 states and regions, 1,000 plus educational institutions, healthcare institutions as well. So it really is a collective effort to reach net zero, and CCS is part of a much larger goal, and definitely can provide a great contribution that has been outlined through different scenarios such as the IEA, and that is also including the IPCC. And I think that's kind of a key point here, is we really have CCS underpinned in science, and that has become further kind of solidified this year through the Summary for Policymakers report for the IPCC. So we really have entered an area where we do need increased national coherence, but also international coherence to make it happen in the most efficient way possible.
Yeah, and I think hand in hand with policy, of course, comes financing. And in the MIDI AOG report, there were a few schemes that were outlined. We don't necessarily have to unpack it, but just generally what investments would be needed to help drive the accelerated deployment of CCS in the country. Maybe Errol, I can pin this one on you.
Yeah. So the report actually mentions that the kinds of incentives that will be needed would be those that, or the indications given are that the kinds of incentives would be those that provide some kind of long-term certainty. Which is why a big recommendation within the report is for the country to actually set up a public finance corporation of some kind that would help with that. There's a mention of carbon taxes. There's also a mention of carbon tax credits, and how they have spurred the development of projects in the US. A really good discussion on what it would take to set up a scheme or a mechanism similar to the 45Q tax credits in the United States. That's those developments that happened in the US over the course of the last few years, especially with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, is not lost on India. India's partnerships with the United States on all levels is high, and also knowledge-based partnerships when it comes to CCS is also pretty high, especially with the DOE. So these kinds of mechanisms are seen favorably, and there's even a discussion on what how that would translate for India in terms of what would it actually cost, or what would those credits look like in the Indian currency. But broadly, I think that the development of or the further kind of development of these mechanisms is yet to be seen. There's a lot on the table, and the government really hasn't made clear indications as to which way they will go. But in that, there is clearly an opportunity, I think, for CCS and for the integration within a broader policy framework.
Vikram, I don't know if you wanted to chime in on that as well.
Yeah, So I think, India does understand, I'm just referring to the different reports, including the G20 Presidency report by India. So we do need, let's say, $1 to $8 billion of investment for deploying CCUS at the scale, even at the scale where we are kind of showing that we can abate, let's say, 1,500 tons per day of captured CO2 by storage in the subsurface. So there can be different risk for that. So assessing those risks are also important. And so basically from the investors, if there are significant risks, they'll be very difficult for them to invest. So therefore, from those, the sequestration tax credits or investment tax credits could be important. And for CO2, that is utilized versus CO2 that is stored, we would need those to be looked into because there is no market currently, and these credits will need to be linked to any kind of inflation that is there. So currently, as you know, the CCS models are largely still based on one-to-one models where one single large bunch source sends you to sink. But across sectors, if we develop the hub and cluster model in India, that would also de-risk investment in CCUS and help in achieving the economies of scale. Multilateral agencies and developmental financial institutions like World Bank and Asian Development Bank could be key sources to finance the initial CCUS projects. And we could develop something like outcome-based sustainability loans or sustainability-linked loans for low-cost financing of CCUS. Green bonds could be deployed for India, and we could look into grant-based funding, and also largely, I would say, the viability gap funding is required at the moment because industries are, yeah, what I understand, are struggling with increased in prices of the products if they incorporate CCUS in their current pathway of operations.
Cognizant we're almost at the top of the hour, but I kind of wanted to maybe wrap things up with opportunities. Maybe Noura, I know in your report you highlight a few ways that folks can get involved. You touched on a few here. Maybe do you want to reiterate a few of those opportunities on how folks can get involved as we head into COP?
Yeah, sure. I think what's interesting about this COP is, not only kind of the new developments that are happening, but also the Global South participation. And interestingly, when we look at the NDCs this year, we're seeing most of the NDCs that have introduced CCS, mentioning CCS in their NDCs come from the Global South. So I think conversations and very interesting conversations can happen. And I think that's a big opportunity that that we could kind of, all kind of join together in the spirit of international cooperation and the forum that and the platform that COP28 offers. So I think that is a key opportunity there. Other than that, I would say just on the financing piece as well, just talking about opportunities and something that is sometimes overlooked, that actually in the Green Climate Fund, we have carbon capture and storage as part of the governing instrument. So it is possible for developing countries to apply for climate finance on CCS projects through the Green Climate Fund. So that would also be an interesting opportunity. And otherwise, we have just more generally in COP28, we're looking forward to announcements for the Carbon Management Challenge. We had some that happened in Goa with the introduction of new countries, Sweden and Brazil, to the list, and so looking to see kind of new joiners and how that will shape up.
That's great. It's been an interesting session. So thanks for everyone being here. But that's all the time we have for today. Daniela, if we can get the final slide up. Yeah, so on behalf of the Institute, I'd like to thank our audience for being here, and I'd like to thank our speakers for sharing their insights. If you'd like to learn more about CCS, you can read our Global Status of CCS report for free. You can download it at www.status22globalccsinstitute.com. If you would like to have a read at the two reports that were mentioned here today, just head to our website, globalccsinstitute.com. and just click the publications tab. It should be there under resources. If you're on social, feel free to follow and interact with us. At Global CCS is our handle. And if you have any additional questions, you can contact us directly at info@globalccsinstitute.com. Thanks everyone for being here. Cheers.